Okay, well, nice to see you. Just throw it open. Anything you want to talk about today?
Well, I've had a PDF of the Mirror Bible for a couple of years, but I actually went and bought the hard copy of it because just for me it's easier sitting down and reading the book, and just so appreciate the work that he's put into that. And it is just so different. I'm having lunch with a friend of mine and I told her about it, and I'm bringing it to let her flip through it, and it will be interesting to see what her response is.
Yeah, I mean, it is obviously it's a translation which is written out of personal encounter and experience, which is why it comes over, why I resonate with it so much, because it feels like they're my experiences. You know, it just feels like that's the God I've met, and that's the Father I've met, and that's so like Jesus. You know, and I know people will criticize it and saying, well, he's translating it from a preconceived perspective, which he is, but that perspective is relational rather than theological. It's relational. But I like the fact that he goes back to the original Greek root words, because they're compound words. I mean, that's the thing with Greek. It's a word that means something, but it's based with two or three words, sometimes all put together. And if you think of Greek as, well, this word can mean five things, this bit can mean five things, this can be, well, essentially you could have 75 potential meanings for the one word. You know, and whose one are you going to choose? Well, you're going to choose one that fits with what you already believe. And I think that's where going back to, well, what was the original intention of what this word meant, and therefore the roots of those words that when you engage in the spirit become living, because it's a living expression. I think that's what comes through when I read it and when I engage it. And yeah, I've got a hard copy. My wife's reading it at the minute. Because Francois contacted me online and sent me a copy, which was very nice. Which was great. And I feel it is something which, it's breathed new life into me reading the Bible. And when I do read it, I just so resonate with the heart behind it, the love of God behind it, the relationship behind it, the eternal relationship behind it. It's that it really does emphasize that we were pre-existing with God. And you know, I love the bit in Ephesians 1 where it says, you know, God found us in Christ before he lost us in Adam. You know, I just love that. I think it's just like, you know, from his perspective, there was no doubt that he was going to lose us because he'd already found us, and and so we could be returned to that face-to-face innocence. You know, and I think that's like, you know, I mean, you can use the Greek word for with, and you could, like, you know, in the beginning, the word was with God, and totally miss the fact that it really means face to face. That was what they really meant by it. That word with meant you were with face. It's a relational word, not just well, we put this word in to connect these two things. Actually, no, this was a relational thing, and that comes out all the way through it. And for me, that's what inspired me when I started to read it, and why I use it quite a lot in stuff now, just saying, hey, look, think about this. You know, how does this, here's what it says in the New American Standard Bible. Now look at it here, and look at how this is unveiling a different relational perspective that we should resonate with. And if you don't, I think some people will be like, well, because their whole theological perspective will be prejudiced against it, basically. You know, if you read it with a relational heart rather than a critical heart, then you will receive something from it in a very different way. And I find that it just unveils things for me. You know, not always. Sometimes I read something and think, No idea what he's on about there. And sometimes it's like, I don't think I would have potentially used that word, but actually the sense of it is there, which is the love and the desire for an intimate relationship with Father and his sons, his children. And that comes through the whole thing. The mirror, when we look into him, we see ourselves reflected back as an image in sonship. And that's, beholding and becoming like that which you behold. I think that is really sort of intrinsically part of, that's why it's called the Mirror Bible. And in that sense, it's mirroring our identity. And I love how he brings out things like, to surname, even in the word ecclesia, it's like ek, and ecclesia, and he brings cleo, and it's like to surname, people who are together surnaming him, carrying his surname, so representing him, it adds something so much to something just to get those, well, here's what the roots of these words really mean,
Well, when you look at the meaning of ecclesia there, it is so different than our concept of church.
Yes.
Completely different. And for me, it's like I have to sit there and read it, and I get it, but I really need to wrap my head around this, because it is so many things that he says are so different. I mean, they really, really speak to me. And most of what I read with him, I totally agree with, but I read it and I say, that's a whole different way of looking at it. And that changes everything. It's not the whole degree, what we've made it. It's something entirely different. And in fact, I was just reading it this morning before we got on the call. I'll just sit down in the morning and I'll just read a chunk of it and just go over it. And so much, and I can see where so much now I can really resonate with. I can see that maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been like, I don't know about this guy. But the same thing with, I think it's Jonathan Welton's translation. Yeah. There were a lot of things in that I would have been like, I don't know about that. And so one of my projects now that I'm just doing for my own enjoyment is, years ago, I bought a book, I think it's called Psalms Alive. And it's where a guy who was a writer took the psalm, he wrote for a magazine, and I guess, I don't know if it was weekly or monthly. He just took a psalm and he rewrote it in today's vernacular. And people really liked it, so he compiled it. So I decided, I think I'm going to try that with Proverbs. Just sit down and write the proverb. If you were sitting here talking today, there's a lot of the language there that you wouldn't use. How would you express it today? But of course, what is coming into it is my theology behind where they were, where I am now, is totally different. But I thought, well, why not? Just for the exercise of it, the expression of it is. Like, I can read it, like we're talking about wisdom and who wisdom is, and really portraying her. This is a real spiritual entity. This isn't, a metaphor of something. This spiritual being really does exist, and she really does. She's really out there, and you really can engage her. And so it's been, for me, just a really good exercise to take something and do this for my own enjoyment, but also to work in what I know now, and to say, if I were to sit down today, this is how I would say it. It would be very different, but instead of just going with what they knew then, bringing in what we know now. Even not some of the, if you want to call it the crazy stuff that we're into, but just the fulfillment of what has happened, that from when it was written, as opposed to over time what occurred, to say, here's where they were, but this is what it, talking about it in a much broader spectrum.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And when I read the Mirror Bible, it's like, you just can't read it and leave it, can you? It's almost like, and sometimes I sort of read some of it out in the slides and things, and I'm realizing that people listening to it they'll need to go back and they'll need to meditate in it. What is that? Wow, what does that mean? How does that affect me? How this different view, how does that relate to how I relate to God? And, it just expresses so much more, and adds to it a sense of passion, excitement, enthusiasm. I was reading Romans 8 the other day in the bit where it talks about, the revealing of the sons of God. And it sort of expresses can you hear the drum roll? Sort of like, and actually that's the sound of the Spirit. It's the sound of that sound coming out of heaven is that drum roll. It's the rhythm of God's heart beating that people are starting to pick up. And it's just expressed there like that, but it conveys so many multiple levels of things. And some people would read that and just take the natural perspective of it. Okay, when something's going to happen, there's a drum roll ready for it to take place. But when you go into then and realize, what is that drum roll? Actually, when you get close to the heart of God and you feel the beating of his heart and the rhythm of his heart, and you're sensing what he's wanting to convey about the season you're in or what's coming, or it feels like that. It feels like here is something that you're catching hold of the rhythm of God's heart, and it's beginning to align you and change you into flowing with that rhythm. And that's the type of thing which I just love. When I read it, it conveys so much more than just the words that are in the original. And of course, he is using the original words to bring that out. It carries with it that, but it comes just with this love, intimacy perspective, which I think just brings it into that I can connect with this. And if I were just to read this, I could experience this, what he's saying. And I have experienced it. That's the thing. It's almost like because I know I've had that, and I've felt that. And that's the God that I met and who talks to me is just like that. He's not this angry God who needs appeasing and he needs me to do all these works to get in his good book and all that sort of stuff, which is sadly, the image that certain people still have. Even in reality, unfortunately, those who are even experiencing heaven, some are still caught up in that. Well, if God, someone contacted me yesterday and sort of challenged, one of the blog posts that we did recently, which was about penal substitutionary atonement and why I felt it was, quite strongly put as a demonic doctrine. But they got so caught up in the fact that I was challenging, as they put, this cornerstone of the Christian faith, and therefore if I was challenging this, then my whole thing of the Bible must be completely out of sync. And they commented on the post and sent me all this stuff. And, with a, warning really to, that I shouldn't be going off into error because, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, okay, I'll read what they said and look at what they said. And what they said just reaffirmed even more of what I know is the truth because of the revelation that come from God. Because they were essentially just quoting the theological perspective. Isaiah 53. Well, this is the cornerstone of, God's penal substitutionary atonement. And the reality is, I'm not against atonement, of course, and I'm not against substitution. I'm just against the penal aspect of that it was a punishment, that God punished Jesus instead of punishing us. Rather than Jesus dying instead of us, which was the true thing. The wages of sin is not punishment. The wages of sin is death. And God brought life to overcome death, not punishment. And so, but people, and what I was accused of doing is emasculating that God so he couldn't be angry. That's what was quoted. You're emasculating God, because they quoted all these Old Testament things where God is blah, and it's just okay. But I know God is angry, but I know he's not angry with me, and he's not angry with his children. He's angry with everything that's robbing us of our identity and our relationship with him. And yes, he will bend his bow and release an arrow, but not into my heart, but into that which is effectively robbing us, and the lies. And actually, the very thing that they wrote was one of those that God will be angry about. He'd be angry about the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement that totally misrepresents him as a loving God who would go to the very depths of love to reach us, you know, and did, dying our death, you know. And it's such an ingrained position within that sort of evangelical perspective. Just person couldn't see that, you know, and was therefore still entrenched in that view of believing we should, you know, God should be angry and we deserve it, essentially, you know, and so we deserve his punishment. And it's only by his grace and mercy that he doesn't punish us, because he punished Jesus instead, you know, not really being open, unfortunately, to, well, what does God say? And I wrote back saying, well, why don't you go and ask God, the Father, to reveal whether he's actually like that, rather than reading the Bible through a confirmatory biased perspective, or taking doctrines that you've got from somebody else because you didn't develop them yourself and believing them because it's always been the case. Because what they were saying was, of course, this has always been the case. So I had to go in and say, well, actually, it wasn't the case in the early church for the majority. Of course, some held, but they never called it penal substitutionary atonement, that's for sure. That didn't come in until Anselm and wasn't really adopted until, you know, the Middle Ages and stuff, you know. So, but yes, some people had the more Tertullian, Augustinian view of God because they were guilty, because they didn't know the love of God or his forgiveness, and therefore were working out of this guilt and shame and condemnation. I mean, read Augustinian's life, and he was operating in terrible shame because he could never overcome his sexual problems. You know, that was some of what went on. And unfortunately, you know, when you know, so I sent them the book of, you know, Athanasius and, you know, his view of the Incarnation, just to say, well, look, this was the 4th century, and the further you go back, you're going to get closer to those that were discipled by Jesus, who discipled those people. Therefore, they're going to carry the heart of the message, not just the words. They carry the spirit of it because it was endued with the life that Jesus brought. And where did Jesus talk about penal substitutionary atonement? You know, who killed Jesus? Mankind, the religious and political spirit killed him. God didn't. You know, and it is that whole sort of sense that unfortunately people can say, well, you're against substitution. Of course I'm not. Jesus died my death. He was the substitute. And of course I was dying. He died for me. He died as me. I died with him. I mean, you know, you couldn't get more completely substitutionary in that. It just wasn't punishment, you know. And I think the Mirror Bible really presents that view of this isn't punishment, you know. And I don't think if you had an intimacy with God which was face to face, that you could fail to realize that that whole view is not correct. I don't think how you could possibly fail to, you know, unless you are so determined to hold on to sort of these tenets of the Christian faith rather than allow God to reveal himself. Because, you know, one of the things, well, you're just interpreting this through your subjective experiences. Yes, I am. Because I would rather interpret through my experience with God, who's love, than through anyone else's theology. You know, the whole point is that we have a personal, intimate relationship with God that reveals him to us, which doesn't have to come through the Bible. You know, I love the Bible has introduced me to him, but has also introduced me to what wasn't him. In reality, because of my interpretation of, or my understanding that's come through someone else's interpretation, framed God up in a way that he had to totally deconstruct by, you know, taking me through experiences that deconstructed it. You know, it wasn't as if I started off believing that. I didn't. I believed the same thing that most people believe about God, that he was angry and needed appeasement and he punished Jesus and that whole view, you know. But having got to know him, you know, and so which is the more loving view of a loving God? You know, and when you come to it, as I said, it's like, you know, I can assure you that my subjective experiences are only making me fall more in love with God and love other people more. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, or do you want me to be angry with everybody to reflect that side of God? Because that's ultimately what the church does, isn't it? To the world, presents the judgment, you know, because it's like, am I against justice? No, it's the foundation of the kingdom, righteousness and justice. But his justice is restorative and not punitive or retributive. Totally different concepts of when you get to know God. He's not retributive, you know. And the reason you have to read the Old Testament and engage the Old Covenant through the lens of the New is you don't see it through the love of Jesus, who's come to express the image of God fully in himself and in his life. And that didn't mean that he was wishy-washy and mamby-pamby and didn't say the truth. He did. And sometimes that truth appears to be very direct and pointed, but he did it because he loved people and didn't want people to stay in the lies of this is what God was like. You know, sadly. You know.
Well, it's interesting. I was reading this morning, and just the way he phrased when Paul is talking about, I think it's to I can't remember if it's Timothy or Titus, about Alexander the coppersmith. And if you go into most of the translations, it's like, okay, you know, watch out for Alexander the coppersmith because he's really done me wrong, and boy, is he going to get it from God. Yeah. And then you read it in the Mirror Bible, and it's like, okay, you know, yeah, he's done things that are wrong, but even he is forgiven. Yes. And even he's going to get repaid by God, but not in the judgment smackdown. It's like, no, even he's been redeemed. So, okay, you got to watch out for him because he will cause you problems, but he's not a hopeless individual. God has already redeemed him. Yeah. I mean, totally different way of looking just of that little portion of scripture, because it takes out all the retribution of like, you know, don't worry, God's going to give him the smackdown. Not at all. It's like, look, he's like everybody else. He's forgiven. Yes, he's caught up into something that has got him deceived, but that God has not written him off. And, you know, yeah, you don't go back and you don't retaliate, but totally different way of just even looking at that little situation. And, you know, when you're talking about the Old Testament, God had to work with them through their preconceived notions, through their cultural biases, the same way that he does with us. And, you know, when he comes out, when you find out that he's not at all what you've believed, you can see the struggle that they went through. Yeah. And he would introduce something and it would be like, you could see where, because it was culturally conflicting with what they knew, or that it was a revelation, Abraham and Isaac. Abraham, sacrifice your son. Well, that was the status quo of the culture that Abraham came from. You may not have liked it, but that's what you did. And then to bring him all the way up to the point and then to stop him and say, no, I'm not like that. I mean, he just took a huge part of the prevailing theology that not only Abraham, but everybody in that zone grew up in, and completely demolished it. And so you can see where he was working with people through what they believed, where it was wrong, and revealing another side. But then you also see the struggle of like, well, they were having a hard time integrating it also, because they were so ingrained that to see that he was something entirely different. You know, in the Mirror Bible, he's talking about in Habakkuk, where it's, you know, where the fig tree doesn't blossom and go on and on and on, but yet I will still rejoice in God. Was like, this was not about punishment. Habakkuk had the revelation that it didn't matter what happened in the natural. That was not the punishment. it was the rejoicing in God despite the circumstances, which is a totally different way of looking at that scripture.
Totally, yeah. And I think this is the key in all of these things, is you have to come through the revelation of the character of God, who is love. Everything he does is love. That is his motivation. It is his essence of who he is. It's his identity. He is love. Therefore, when you read those things, you have to read it through the lens of love. And it's always going to be written through the perspective of the one who wrote it. And I think this is where, did God inspire that person to write it? Yes, but God didn't dictate it. They're writing it through poetry or prose or story or history. And they are writing it in their own idiomatic way of attributing these things to God, when it wasn't actually God, but God was saying, well, I have to take my hands off here because they're choosing to go their own way, like the children of Israel going after foreign gods and going back. And he's like, okay, well, if you choose to go that way and you want that God, well, you can't have this one as well. So there are consequences of following that God. Is I can't be your God. So I'm going to remove my hand of protection from you because you've chosen to ask for the protection of another God. So now the Philistines are upon you, and or the Midianites or the Moabites, and they're going to take you captive. And then in that, why did God do it? So that they were returned to him, not that he would punish them. That he wasn't punishing them for what they did. He was allowing them to suffer the consequences of their own choices, to make them realize that actually it's so much better here with God, you know? And in doing that, when they realized, what did he do? You're not coming back to me. He restored them, gave them another judge, rose up someone who would cause them to have victory, and then restored them back into the land and into the relationship again, you know? And that over and over again is ultimately what he did, until then he brings a new covenant and invites all those from the old covenant to come into the new covenant, where they would have a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. And now it was going to be a totally different relational understanding of this and how it could be worked out. And I'm inviting you to come into this. Yes, he divorced Israel for their unfaithfulness to him, but not so that they would be continually divorced, but so that they could come into the new covenant, which they wouldn't do if the old one was working for them, you know? And, you know, it's that type of where people just don't see that, what you're describing in terms of the cultural context and the fact that, did God want them to do all these animal sacrifices? Well, very clearly, no, according to the prophets, but they wanted to. And when you read that they came out of Egypt with all these things to sacrifice to Molech and all these things, they brought those gods and carried them around the wilderness for 40 years. I mean, it's just like, oh. So it's like, okay, well, I want to give you all this revelation as a father to you, and I'm calling you into this marriage relationship with me in another analogy, but you want to sacrifice to a golden calf that you've made. So, okay, if that's what you want, then Moses, give it to them, you know? And then for 40 years, you don't get any Passover. And I think the Passover is the full expression of what God wanted. This was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And the Passover was a personal experience, not a corporate thing on behalf of the whole thing. And what was it a Passover of? Death. Not punishment, death. You can be saved from death by taking this lamb, which is a representation of actually Jesus, yes, before the foundation of the world, but it wasn't the same sacrificial system that then was introduced, which was a sacrificial system like the other nations had, but we're going to limit it so you can't sacrifice your children and all the other things that you might do. So we'll put in some regulations to make sure you don't do what the other nations will do, which is actually what you really wanted to do, you know? And the same thing applies then when they say, well, give us a king. Well, give us a king. Well, I'm your king. Why do you want another king? We want a king like all the other nations. We want to be like them. They have a king. So, okay, we'll have a king. So now God isn't punishing them with the king. They are suffering from the warnings that he gave them. This is what it will be like when you have a king. He's going to take taxes up from you. He's going to do this. He's going to do that, all that stuff, and then God even weaves that into the story, and Jesus comes from the line of David, who is a man after God's own heart. But would have David been king if they hadn't asked for one? No. And he wouldn't have been. But would he have been fulfilling his destiny as a man after God's own heart? I'm sure he would. And he would have no doubt had a prominent place within Israel, representing the nature of God. And no doubt he would have still been a psalmist. And he would have still had all those amazing relationships with God, which would have been released for us. But he wouldn't have been a king if God was still king. And maybe the tabernacle of David, which is the open worship, would have been embraced and continued, and they wouldn't have built a temple. Because the consequence of having a king was the consequence of building a temple. So we then have another, how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of God's in a temple somewhere rather than he's open and everyone can access him. And now we only have a priest who's the professional who can go into the temple and represent us, when we've just had this amazing thing where we're all in the presence of the ark of God's person and he's there. That's one of the things when I meet David sometime, I'm going to ask him, why did you go from that back to wanting to build a temple? Why what on earth caused you to do it? Because it was like, oh.
Well, maybe because he had the vision and he saw it. But it's possible that he realized that as a whole, the people really didn't get it. Possibly. And if he didn't give them something, it was going to be, and maybe also realize that Solomon didn't get it either. So to hand that over to Solomon, it wasn't going to fly. And maybe it's like, okay, we'll put the temple back up. At least we'll have something that it would be better than nothing, because maybe he could see this was all going to fall apart because either the people or his son or both really didn't get it. They never really got the whole idea of that open relationship with God. We had the school shooting, I guess it was last week, which of course is just an absolute, horrendous thing. And there was the whole thing on Facebook, and someone actually had posted a picture of a t-shirt, and I had shared it on my wall. And it was like, the student is writing to God, where were you when this happened? And the answer is, dear concerned student, I can't go where I'm not invited. So I put that up. Well, I really got some flack on that. And I said, but it really comes down to it. When you ask him to step aside, he is going to do that. His job is not to step in and intervene every time. That's just not how it works. And when you purposely say, please leave us alone here, then he has to allow you to take the consequences of, well, yeah, I'd love to help you, but you don't want my help, so you're going to have to figure this out on your own. And some of the consequences, it's not that he's mad, it's not punishment. And it's funny because my sister and I, we chat back and forth, and she knows the whole thing about us leaving our church. And, because we were raised Catholic, and she's still in the Catholic Church. And she said, well, why don't you come back to the Catholic Church? And I said, well, I said, I think my theology is just sort of way out there. And she goes, well, like what? What do you mean? So I started telling her some things. And it was sort of like, what do you mean you can take communion? That has to be administered by a priest. And I'm like, no.
Who said?
Who said? She's very much interesting about you have to have the priest. And then, that Peter was the first bishop. And I said, well, no. I said, for one thing, the whole concept, Pope. I said, the whole concept of a Pope, I said, the early church was Jewish. I said, they had no concept of what we now know as a religious hierarchy. I said, if you could see Peter now and call him the Pope, he'd probably look at you and sort of chuckle, because I said, that didn't come in until under Constantine, when everything became organized. I said, yes, I said, the apostles were sort of like a governing body. I said, but they worked together. There was not the single person. Peter may have been the spokesperson, but he wasn't the one just pulling stuff out of it, on his own. This was a combined effort. It was always done with a group of people. So you go back and read the early church history, and it didn't look anything at all like what we consider church now. I said, so she was like, oh, well, yeah, I guess I can see you are really different. And I mean, I think a lot of it for her is really a head scratch, because she just can't get any of it. She's, well, you mean you can have a water and cracker? And I said, well, yeah. I said, but when I take it in, I said, I fully expect that to be transformative in my system. I expect it to change my DNA and my genetic structure. That, I think, was a little bit like, what?
Well, they're into transubstantiation. So they believe when they take a piece of physical bread and drink some wine, it turns into the actual body and blood of Jesus.
But
so
they
it's not
don't
that a stretch.
But they don't go the stretch to where when you're taking it in that it changes you.
No, I know.
And that's the thing there that was just, and then because it wasn't the official host administrated by either the priest or, I think now, I'm not sure if there are other people in the church, like you can be a quote unquote a deacon where you can assist, unless you get it in the official format, that doesn't qualify. And I said, well, how about people that don't have access to the church? I said, are they eliminated from taking communion? If that's the only way you can get it, and you're in a position that you cannot get to church for whatever the reason, is that then like, oh, so sad, too bad, you're out of the, you just don't qualify. And so I know that I said some things that really sort of like, really upset her, and it really came down to, and it was like, okay, you really are really different. You wouldn't fit back into the Catholic Church.
Yeah. And it is, when you go back to your original point, if you exclude God from the schools and there's no prayer in schools and you can't do all that stuff, then you can't turn around and blame him, as you say, for not going where he isn't invited, or where actually he's excluded in reality. But the sad thing is then when that then is seen as, well, this must be God's judgment on something and punishing some people, that's where it really gets twisted. Yeah, they can say, well, where were you, God? And yes, he can say, well, where do you expect me to be? But then the reality is, it's a big thing. Well, them others will become, well, they must have done something to deserve it, or, God's obviously, this is God's judgment on the system of America, or whatever it might be, which obviously some Christians will take that view of anything like this, in some of the other things in Orlando, is that, some were saying, okay, well, God would have sent the gunman. He would have actually inspired him to go and shoot all those people. I mean, because they have this twisted view of God, who is not the God, obviously, that we know and which we have experienced and which we're learning. And so, the old covenant, new covenant, old way of doing things, you can't have that when you've met him, when you really met him. And I don't just mean reading about him. When you've truly met him face to face, you cannot hold on to those views for very long, because they're just so cognitively dissonant. They create such tension that you'd blow up if you try and keep hold of two views for very long, which sort of leads me to the conclusion that a lot of people have not really met God face to face. They just have known about him, had experiences of him in worship times and all that, but not really met him face to face. Because when you meet him face to face, not only does what you see him to be like changes, but you change. How can you not change when you've beheld this amazing, loving father or loving brother? It's like, how can you not change? And the only reason you can't change if you are not seeing him in his true light, because that will keep you in, well, if God's got the angry side, well, so can we. Well, why should we forgive people if God doesn't? And well, that's the thing. Well, we can punish people if God does. We can go and take vengeance, and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, if God does. Well, Jesus did come and turn that one on its head. You've heard it said, but now I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for them who treat you bad. And Jesus did say, Father, forgive them, without them asking for it or deserving it in any way, but him still giving it irrespective of whether they deserve it or not. And that's the God that the world will turn to when they can see him. And we need to get a momentum of where they are seeing him through us like that. And the institutional church does not portray that true nature of God. They are portraying a false image. In fact, they are calling people to come and worship an idol, which is not who God really is at all. And we need to see that change. It's got to start in us. So we need an intimacy with God, which is going to enable us to really represent that, and him, by him flowing through us and in us and working through us. So I do really find it difficult when people just come out with this harsh, God who needs appeasing and who's essentially a cosmic child abuser, who would abuse his own children because he loves us so much. Well, if he would do that to that son, well, what will he do to us? Because that's ultimately the answer, isn't it? If he'll do it to his real son, well, how will we do it to his adopted sons? In fact, we aren't really adopted. We've always been his children from his perspective. The adoption is only something that helps us.
Another thing that my sister and I will get into, of course, with the whole school shooting, she's totally for all total gun control, and she's in that. And the point that I was trying to make back to her is, you can do that, but until you really change the heart of man, if somebody wants to do something, they are going to find a way to do it. That's only a symptom of what the real problem is. Because I mentioned to her, and I mean, when I was growing up, during hunting season, guys would have guns racked in the back of their truck, loaded. They would even be in the school parking lot because it was hunting season. And so the gun was back there because on the weekends or after school you went hunting. I said, nobody ever dreamed of bringing a loaded gun into school, but they'd be sitting. Now, you can't do that now. If you had a loaded gun in the school parking lot, it's all over but the crying, because that happened to a kid who accidentally, it happened, and he went to them and said, hey, we were out, and I just realized that it got the weapon got left in the car. Can I call my mother to come get it? And they were going to throw him out of school in the whole 9 yards. Back in the day, that happened, but nobody ever thought of doing it. Nobody ever ran out into the parking lot. I said, it's not the weapon. It's the heart of man. If you want to do something, you will find a way. It's a heart condition. Well, she thinks it will go, if we get rid of all the weapons, all this is going to end. It's like, man, that's not the way it works. But it's like you're dealing with the symptom of what the real problem is. And that all comes into, I think, ties into when you really don't know who he is, and you think that he's retributive, and you think that he's angry. Well, for one thing, if you're angry, that gives you, like you said, the justification to say, like the Orlando shooting. Well, hey, this is what God would do to his enemies. I must be his warrior, that I have to go in and execute this judgment. And you can delude yourself into thinking, I've got this call of God, I've got to do it. So the whole concept of who God really is and how he views us, it can change everything. And it will change everything when people have that, when they get that revelation of like, it's not what you thought it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, the culture that we live in affects us, and in the UK, we don't have a gun culture. It was never been part of the right to bear arms. It was never there. I'm not really sure whether they meant the right to bear arms in the way which has been interpreted now, even when the founding fathers actually put that into the Constitution, I'm not sure their heart would have, if they looked at what was going on now, they would probably be horrified, you know, in terms of how it's been misused. I mean, interestingly, when you don't have a gun culture, for instance, when we had a school shooting about in the 1990s or something in Dunblane in Scotland, and in the aftermath of that, they brought in regulations in which handguns could only be shot in shooting ranges and had to be kept within shooting ranges. It was brought in immediately after that, so people couldn't keep their own handguns and then go and shoot them in the range. They had to keep them in the range. There was no outcry. There was no outcry whatsoever because we didn't have a gun culture. Our police aren't armed primarily, so we don't have that side of things in the UK. And no one was up in arms about it whatsoever. Everyone accepted it. People who like shooting handguns kept them in a shooting range. No issue. We've never had another school shooting in that whole time. Not one. So, and I'm not saying that the law stopped the shooting, but we don't have a culture that influences people so much. Yes, okay, there's gangs and there are guns and there is obviously gun crime, but the percentage of people that get shot and die in our country from firearms is probably thousands of percentages less than yours. Even taking into account that we've only got 70 million and you've got 200 or 300 million, the culture does have an influence on how people behave. And people don't behave that way in our country because we don't have that culture. So when you then take into account people's own influences or what's in their hearts, in our culture, they wouldn't immediately take to go and shoot somebody, you know, because it just isn't there. So it is the personal aspect of, yes, we're all capable of doing terrible things, but when you're in a culture, that culture also affects what sort of things you might do, you know. And I think I was, you know, somewhat horrified to hear Donald Trump's solution this morning on the news when I was driving to work, that he was going to arm the teachers. If all the teachers were armed, well, that would solve the problem because they will be able to shoot these people really quickly and stop them killing people. So let's introduce more guns into school to solve the problem of some people taking guns into school, which was like, you know, again, doesn't deal with the real root issues of why people are suffering with mental health issues, while people are suffering with poverty, while there's the divide between races and color and that still operates within the culture that's there. Those are the real issues, and those are never going to be solved with a political agenda. You know, they're only going to be solved by a spiritual one. And, you know, but it is obviously a very emotive thing that happens when these type of things happen. And it seems this time that those that are survived and those are much more militant about, well, something's got to change, you know, change the culture, you know, change this. And gun control, I know, is not the answer. Changing the culture is, and I don't think you're going to change the culture unless you change the people and deal with the spiritual things behind it, you know, which is, you know, obviously a huge challenge. You know, to change a culture of a nation, you're going to need the sons of God to rise up and be revealed for sure at a whole different level than is happening now to do that. But one of the, you know, there are two houses which are one of the 12 chancellors' houses, Culture House and Fairs of the Nations House, and we can begin to engage there for the strategies and the revelation and the commissioning of people to come into roles that can begin to bring that. Because ultimately, I saw a quote by Justin Abraham last week about, you know, eventually, you know, there's going to be no war. You know, the Bible says it, you know, they will be beating their weapons into things to produce more fruitfulness. Well, do we think that is impossible? Or do we believe that that is where we're going when the sons of God begin to change culture and the affairs of the nations to bring it back and restore it to God's original intent and purpose, which would never have been for war, you know. And so you read those things in Isaiah and other places, and you just think, you know, and I know a lot of that is been eschatologically put off to some future utopia rather than this age. But I do believe in this age, we will see that if we continue to mature into sonship and actually get revealed on earth as we're engaging and living seated in heavenly places. You know, I believe in the restoration of all things, which includes culture and each nation to come back into one. Ultimately, I believe there won't be any nations in the same way they are now, because there wasn't in the beginning. God didn't have the desire for nations. That was man's desire to create a name for himself and try and do that in an inappropriate way. And then people then collected together according to the languages that were and developed their own cultures and nations. God wants every family of the earth to be blessed. That was his covenant commitment through Abraham, that you would be a blessing to every family of the earth, not every nation. Because nations primarily mean separation. Family talks about relationship. Nations means, well, we are different from you, and we're going to defend our culture and our nation, and we're going to defend our territory against you because you might take it from us. All that was done is just expressed even more. We are making a name for ourselves, whether that be Britain or America or Russia or China or any other nation. It's about our culture and our identity, as opposed to we are God's children and part of his family, and he wants our families to be in relationship with each other, not trying to work out diplomacy to try and keep everyone from stop beating each other up or stealing from each other all the time. Because it was covenant relationship, which a covenant relationship was for mutual benefit and blessing, not fear and control, you know. But we're, you know, have to see the people of God come into that place of sonship. The institutional church is never going to do it, is it? Yeah, unless that is restored to what it should be, which is relationship. You know? But it's going to take some time for that to take place. Yeah. But can a nation be changed in a day? The Bible says it can. So can a nation be formed in a day? Okay, well, the Bible says it can. So I think, you know, things can change quite quickly when you get a momentum or a tipping point, the point where there are more people in God's governmental position of sonship than there are outside of it. And that's obviously what we're looking for. That's why we need a harvest. You know, we need a harvest to have that tipping point come, where then we will be ruling and governing and establishing the kingdom. And which is, so getting back to our first point, why we so need a relationship with God that reveals him, because the foundation of is righteousness and justice. And we're never, as sons of God, going to be able to reflect him if we've never met him, or come out with these views of him that are completely twisting the nature and character of who he really is. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, anyone else got any questions? Things to talk about?
Wow. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. You know, we've been working through the courts, and we're working through the courts. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Turn it up a bit.
After going through a couple of prayers, notice change. And in fact, I had an encounter about 2 days after, and it just confirmed a few things. So we're really excited about that kind of progress. And I think you have something, right?
I wanted to just ask about going to court on someone else's behalf. You mentioned clearly that don't go in there like on the behalf of a nation area unless you had the authorization. So I just wanted to talk about, say, our children. Even though they may be older and not living in the house anymore, and you might know some of their situation in life, can you go to court on their behalf?
Yes, to the degree really in which you have that within the sphere of authority you're operating in. But to go to court on behalf of our children is to bless them, not control them. You know, you cannot use the court system to make someone do what you want them to do. You have to go to bless them, remove obstacles that are hindering them knowing who they really are as children of God, knowing their destiny, fulfilling it, so that essentially the conditions in their life can be to contribute to their journey to discover God rather than obstacles blocking them. So obviously when you have children who are at home and they're living within your actual physical sphere, then we would have, in a sense, an opportunity of demonstrating to them something very different when they're living outside of that sphere, and you see them now and again, or you communicate, but you're not continually in that place where you're able to physically demonstrate something. But as we are parents, we do have the authority to bless, and therefore I think we can bless them, and we can call forth their blessing and destiny, and we can administrate and legislate for that to take place. But ultimately they have the final choice whether they accept a relationship with God or an outworking of their destiny for God's purpose rather than their own. And sometimes, you know, God will use all things to work together for good. So in every bad thing that happens, which he doesn't make happen, he still can use it and still redeems things to bring good out of it. So sometimes he uses some of the difficult situations our children get in to help them to look in the right direction for the solutions to their problem. And sometimes we need to make sure we do not enable them to stay in their problem by getting them out of it. You know, so, and parents, that is a real challenging one, because you don't want to see your children suffering in any way. You don't want to see your children, you know, because you love them and you want the best for them. But giving them what you think they need is maybe very different from what God wants them to have, or helping them out of a situation and enabling them to continue in the lifestyle they had before. Let's say they get into really bad debt, and they've got into really bad debt because they're materialistic. You know, they're buying all sorts of stuff that they don't need because they bought into the culture of this is going to make me feel better, and they've bought the advertising campaigns and they're got into debt. And you have the money to get them out of debt. You can't assume that you should unless you're really clearly directed by God to do so. Otherwise, they won't learn. You know, so we have to look at it from, God, what do you want me to do? And what are you doing in this? Now, it doesn't mean you abandon them. You don't obviously let them go so they've got nothing to eat, because you can invite them around your place if they live close enough to come and eat with you. So you have more opportunity of talking to them and building the relationship, which you can then maybe challenge some of their materialistic views. So you got to look at it from, God can use those situations to facilitate people turning to him for help. And therefore, if we get them out of the situation, then they won't need to turn to him for help because they've turned to us for help. And we've helped them. And that's not to say that we shouldn't. And we've helped our children in different ways, sometimes financially and sometimes in other ways. But sometimes it's like, no, you don't have permission to bail them out of this one. They need to learn through this to be wise. Then, okay, so what can we do? Well, let's help you to manage your finances and to budget. Because that's the wise thing to do. Don't spend money you haven't got. And actually, why are you thinking that that's going to make things better? when all it's done is got you into trouble. It can open up obviously conversations that can be then godly wisdom can be introduced into it to help, you know. And so, yes, we have authority, but we don't have authority to force anything. And we do really need wisdom in those environments. And I know, you know, those that have had children who've been into addictions and different things, it's a huge issue of whether you try and help them because you don't want to see them suffering and everything else. But usually people only get out of addictions when they've got to the point where they hit rock bottom and there's nowhere else to go. And if you don't let them hit rock bottom, they may never get to the point where they want out. So you know, I guess in addiction counseling circles and rehabilitation circles, it will be called tough love. You know, and I know of stories where parents have got in trouble with the authorities and the police because they have bought drugs on behalf of their children because they didn't want their children to be, you know, suffering. And they've ended up prosecuted for buying drugs when they would never ever take drugs, but they've been so moved by the compassion to help their children, they've done something illegal to do it, and that's never going to be right, you know. So it is a difficult one, and being a parent and knowing some of the things my children have been through or still going through at times, you just have to, for me, legislate behind the scenes, call for the blessing on their lives, do whatever you can to help that, but ultimately it's down to their choices, whether they choose to accept God's help in it or not, you know. So it is not an easy one when it comes to that sort of stuff, but you do have authority to a degree, let's say, and you definitely have authority to bless and provide an environment of blessing. But blessing is the empowerment to prosper and succeed, and sometimes to help people succeed, they've got to fail first, because they then run out of their own strength and realize they're never going to do it on their own. And even in like the addiction settings, you know, people get into 12-step programs. The first thing is, I do not have the power on my own. There must be a higher power that I turn to. Well, we want to help them obviously turn to the higher power, which is God, and not just any old thing. But they're taught to show, look, you can't do this in your own strength. You need support. And therefore having a mentor or a peer mentor or a sponsor or whatever is part of their process, because they are always looking for help from others, which is no different from discipleship in that sense. You know, but they have to recognize that they can't do it in their own strength. And sometimes that's hard, you know, and people will go through many challenges of trying to do things in their own strength. You know, I mean, we work with people with addictions, and most of them have gone through, I don't know how many times. I was talking to a guy a couple of days ago, and I was going through the gym, and he was basically saying, look, I want to get into rehab. You know, can you help me? You know, I've been a heroin addict since I was 15 years old, and I'm 41. And I just want out of this lifestyle. I don't want to be this way anymore. Can you help? You know, but then he went on to describe how many times he tried in his own strength to do it, and how he got this, and then, you know, then this circumstance would happen, and that circumstance would happen, and then this circumstance would happen, and then, oh, it didn't all work out. And then you know, the last time he said, you know, I was at this point where I really cried out for help, and it didn't come the way I thought. Then I relapsed because it was like, whoa, you know, and it was sad to hear, you know, but that's the story of all of us when we try and fix ourselves or self-medicate to try and ease our pain or deal with the reason why our needs aren't being met, or all those things of lack of identity that, you know, people suffer from. You know, most people are self-medicating, or the materialistic way is, well, I'll just have a bigger car, a better house, or more money, and then I'll be happier, which material things will never meet the spiritual need that people have for love and acceptance and affirmation and all the things that God wants to give us all. which you can't get from somebody else. You know, that's the reality. There's no way you can get any of that stuff from anyone else. And we try, of course, you know, and we even try and do it within our own relationships of marriage. You know, I cannot meet my wife's needs and she cannot meet mine. And if I'm expecting her to, in a spiritual sense, I'm going to drain her dry and she'll have nothing left to give because I am demanding of her. All my responsibility is try and be the best husband I can be. I can't demand that she's the best wife or look to her and it's her problem. It just don't work that way. As much as, you know, relationships are difficult and all the things you go through in those relationships, but all our needs are supposed to be met in God so that we're full of that to bless other people, to help them meet their needs in God, not try and get into a codependent relationship. Well, oh, this someone has all these needs and I have a need to be needed, so I can help them meet their needs and it will meet my need. And so you get into a and you can get codependent relationships between parents and children, which is why we try and help them out, because actually we want to be the good guy and we want to be seen, and therefore we wouldn't go do things. The same with husband and wife. You know, sometimes people are in relationships, codependency as husband and wife, because they came in both broken, you know, and that their brokenness facilitated them coming together, you know, and until both get fixed, then the relationship will never be healthy or whole, you know. And that's a challenge, obviously, that the whole of our culture and societies face, you know, of brokenness and fragmentation, and rather than peace in terms of what God wants us to live in wholeness and everything else. So, yeah. Okie dokie. All right. Okay. We'll better leave it there. I've got
You got it?